Welcome to Support Life, a program focusing on current social issues from a life-affirming perspective. I'm Gavin Baulch, and my guest is Mary Doogan, a Senior Labour Ward Midwife from Glasgow in Scotland. Welcome, Mary, to Australia.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here.
Glasgow, what a great place. How far away can you get? And it's colder here than there.
Well, I think I was expecting it to be a little bit milder than it is, but a bit of a shock actually. It's not far off what our springs would be. You know, the weather here,
yes.
but I think I was expecting it to be a slightly tad warmer.
Okay, so you can't use your surfboard?
I can't use my surfboard. Even if I could use one, I couldn't use it.
All right, so you're one of 7 children?
That's correct, yes, yes.
It's kind of almost in the middle, number 3.
Number 3, yeah.
All right. And you experienced from your parents a degree of suffering that they went through. What was happening in family life?
Well, like many people, my parents come from Donegal in Ireland, and they came from a very poor background, both of them. They met in Glasgow in the 40s and 50s, and even earlier than that. There was great migration from many parts of Ireland, and a lot of people settled in the west of Scotland. Some settled, permanently, but many others went across to America, Canada, some to New Zealand and Australia, but mostly it was the west to America. But my parents met in Glasgow, and they married, but very early on, my mother, she had the family, she had six of us quite quickly, but my father, he became unwell because he had a brain tumour, and it wasn't known. In those days, diagnosis wouldn't have been as sophisticated and as accurate as it is today. So he was treated for depression for quite a long time. However, once they found out that it was this tumour, he ultimately ended up with undergoing something like 9 brain operations, and he was left permanently a permanent invalid. He was blind and paralysed, and so my mother reared us all on her own. And I often say she was a single mother before it became fashionable. But so she had an awful lot of suffering to go through with my father's ill health, and no real income, and having to feed 7 young children. And as we look back, although those were very poverty-stricken years, really, but it was my mother that had that burden, because children don't really grasp it. As long as they've got their mother there. We knew my father was ill, and I would say that's different again from maybe fathers that are just not present for other reasons, maybe through choice or whatever. But we knew my father was very loved, and he loved us. So although he wasn't there with us, he was in hospital. The story of my mother and father's love was really paramount to our upbringing. Wow. So tough times for my mother especially. All
right, now you've seen suffering. What did you have to do with spina bifida? Oh,
well, the last of the 7 of us, little Breed, she actually only lived for 3 weeks. But I remember the time, I was about 8 years of age, and we lived in this poor area of Glasgow, but the community, which was mostly the Irish people that lived there, I could remember the sense of seriousness about my mother going in to have this baby, and there was no joy. It was just seriousness and sadness. And anyway, I was old enough to understand when my mother came home that the baby wasn't well. So my little sister Breed had spina bifida and hydrocephaly, and we were aware that she was very, very ill. And there was one day my mother was wanting to make her cot, and she let me hold this baby. So little Breed was put into my hands, and I remember thinking, this child's got something very badly wrong with her, and I had to be very careful in how I handled her and gently deal with her. But I've always knew that, even from a young age, that it was a very special experience for me to hold this baby. Anyway, she lived for 3 weeks, but again, her memory and her acceptance and my mother's love for her, and we've never forgotten her. So she lived 3 years, it's 3 weeks on this earth, but her memory is still very, very strong, and she's part of our family, and that's why 7 children.
Yes.
Including Breed. So that's left its mark in life. I suppose.
So this is where somehow the mystery of suffering, along with the memory that was so positive from that suffering, somehow you've become the woman that you are today.
Yeah.
But there's a spiritual dimension, surely. I mean, we give up so easily otherwise.
Well, I often wonder how people do cope with life without understanding the spiritual, because from a very young age, you very quickly learn that there are some people who live for short periods of time, because maybe school, I remember a young girl that was knocked down and killed when she was very young, so you learn that it's quite young that maybe you won't be here for a very long time, and you do start to ask questions when you are young. You don't wait till you're teenagers, or those questions start just as soon as you're able to ask the questions. You don't ask necessarily of other people, but you've got those questions going around your mind. And being brought up in a Catholic family and background, the spiritual dimension was always very, very strong, and it made sense. I remember going into the church, the famous church in Glasgow, St Francis. It was in the famous place called Gorbals, which was home to thousands of the Irish, poor area. But I remember going into that church many occasions and looking up at the big crucifix of Christ suffering. And children do that, and they question and think and ask. You know, they don't ask the adults, but they're talking to themselves about it. So those imprints were left in my mind. And then, as you see in life, that other people and suffering is there. And then you're educated in your faith, your Christian faith. It all ties in. And that's the only sense you can make of suffering.
Yes.
If it's tied to the cross of Christ. That's the only sense you can make of it.
All right. Now, what about just suffering for yourself? What have you gone through recently? So we won't talk about events and activities, just your own health.
My own health, well, because of the dispute back home and that's ended up in the courts, which we'll probably speak about later, but I became very unwell just over 5 years ago, and it resulted in this very severe urticaria angioedema syndrome. And for 3 good years it just felt as if my body was a terrible blister that you couldn't satisfy, with the itching that was everywhere and terrible sleep patterns because of it. You could never satisfy. No matter what lotions or whatever you took, it wasn't sorting the problem out at all.
Well, Mary, what we're going to do, we're going to let people hang on that thought, and we're going to come back to what happened next.
Okay.
You're watching Support Life, and we'll be back after the break. Welcome back to Support Life. I'm Gavin Baulch, and my guest is Mary Doogan, a Senior Labour Ward Midwife from Glasgow, Scotland. Well, Mary, we have got to a point where we're looking at your own personal suffering, where your body has sores, the medicines, the lotions are not working. Tell me about what it's like to be trapped in that sort of body.
Well, you realise you can't do an awful lot about it, no matter in dementia, in the sense that you're demented with what's happening to you, but you have no control over it. And you feel very, very, very weak.
Yes.
And just your own humanity is really brought to its knees. And all you can do is pray and get other people to pray and support. But I have to say that despite all of that, I could still feel God very, very powerfully with me.
Okay, so in this weakness, strength comes from outside of yourself.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
All right. Now, you've carried a burden with a conscience and compassion for others way beyond what your own physical capacity is to carry.
Yeah.
What stirred your conscience? Was it always there?
Yeah, the sanctity of life. The sanctity of life. I was talking to some people yesterday, and I think that label, when people say they're pro-life, asserting that they're pro-life, for me to think about that, it's an alien assertion, because I think everybody's born pro-life. It's almost like the state of being that you're in. You have to learn to not be pro, or to be pro-other things rather than pro-life. So I think it's something that's just with people. And the question isn't, are you pro-life? It's, you're not pro-life? That should be the question. You know, in every aspect, not just in one area more than another, but in every aspect of life.
Mm-hmm. So you've touched on the gift that came from a very ill father,
Mm-hmm.
from a sibling that
Mm-hmm.
lived a very short period of time. And you represent, as you talk to me, that well-known book in Scripture called Job,
Mm-hmm.
where he scraped his sores.
Yes. Yes.
You can identify with him, can't
Absolutely, and I did read the passage on more than one occasion.
you? Mm-hmm.
So yes, I was brought to the point where everything I had, you know, I'd given it, and definitely God was demonstrating that, humanly speaking,
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't take this on myself. It wouldn't be my work. But despite all of that, it gave me great belief and knowledge that He was there,
Okay.
no matter how dark it got.
All right, well, let's turn the clock back a little bit, and we are going back to the 27th of November 2008. What happened?
I was at work, and there had been this dialogue amongst my managers about the issue of conscience, and a number of staff were getting concerned because the Labour Ward was getting more women coming to the Labour Ward for termination of pregnancy, abortion of their babies who were handicapped babies, disabled babies. So I was trying to get this resolved because there were a number of us who always had exercised our conscientious rights, and that had never been a problem. However, through dialogue and different people coming to work in our place, there was an attempt to change what was meant by conscience, what we were allowed to do or not to do. So I phoned up my professional body, the Nursing and Midwifery Council in London, for clarity about that. And they gave me advice which was wrong, absolutely wrong, but I was in such a state of shock about what they were saying, because what I was aware of is if that's what the professional body is saying, then the new management were not going to take a different tack. And I knew that day I was going to have to fight this situation. And it was all my security was all shaken. My foundations were totally shaken, and I couldn't share it with anyone. But I came home, and once I came home, I've got an image of the Divine Mercy and the Blessed Mother statue and the crucifix above in the Bible, and I dropped to my knees and I just said, "Dear God, this is huge. I said, you're going to have to do something to help me." And I picked up the Bible and just let it open at random. And just to see where I was, I flicked one page, and it was Exodus chapter 1, verse 15. Now I'll just say the passage before it, in case those people who are listening don't know. It was about the people, when the Hebrew people were in captivity in Egypt, Pharaoh was worrying because the men were growing in strength and in numbers. So he put greater burdens onto them, but that wasn't suppressing them the way he wanted it. So, verse 15, it said he called the Hebrew midwives Shifra and Puah, and he told them, look between the stones. Women gave birth pressing down on the stones. If it's a girl, let her live. If it's a boy, kill him. But the midwives were God-fearing and wouldn't do as Pharaoh told them. So Pharaoh called them again, said, you haven't obeyed me, to the midwives. But they said, the Hebrew women are stronger, they've delivered. The point of the matter was, midwives was mentioned 7 times. And in it, they were refusing to kill the baby boys, the Israelite baby boys. And I knew, well, he must have realised how dense I was to be told, 7 times midwives was mentioned. But that has absolutely sustained me right through the past 7 years. Is that, and there have been other incidents and issues along the way of his hand and providence and all this, but that's the first thing he showed me. So
could we say that there's been a subtle shift and the life of a girl is now at greater risk?
You've absolutely picked that up, and it's incredible that people who say they're interested in women's issues will actually defend that practice, and I find that totally incomprehensible. It's an abomination.
Yes.
Terrible. Terrible.
Well, we'll allow our viewers, men and women, young and old, to consider the value of their life.
Mm-hmm.
You're watching Support Life, and we'll be back after the break. Welcome back to Support Life. I'm Gavin Baulch, and my guest is Mary Doogan, a Senior Labour Ward Midwife from Glasgow in Scotland. Mary, we're talking about this wonderful privilege to be a woman.
You're right.
In so many ways,
Mm-hmm.
and you guys trump us a little bit in certain areas, and yet we're shortening the lives or
Mm-hmm.
potential of many possible young women. Talk about that a little bit. How can this be?
It's beyond understanding, to be honest. I mean, I suppose if it's come from cultures that regard the male children as being greater than the female, then I have to conclude that that's a very disordered way of thinking. If it results in the death of so many, not even so many, of even one child purely because this is a girl, it's incomprehensible to me, to be honest, how anybody can justify that, and how they can say that they have a belief system that actually wants that to be the case.
And I apologise as a male if I in any way have contributed to allowing abortion to continue.
Well, I have to say, I've thought of this many times. There are many, many women who say they're for women's rights, and they radically support that practice. For me, that's a contradiction in terms. A total contradiction.
Yes.
So that's something I can't comprehend either.
You were saying earlier that as children, we're aware of the transience of life.
Yeah.
You know, when the little goldfish dies, it's a tragedy. For those of us that appreciate the animal kingdom and we may not want to kill for food, then we place a lesser value on human life.
Absolutely. And you will find a lot of people back home. There was a few years ago, there was a ban on fox hunting, and the massive support that generated in the Houses of Parliament, and yet they see humans as so much lesser, which is a very sad state of affairs, to be honest.
Okay, so as a senior midwife, this journey, tell me about the journey and how you've been sustained and what you're standing up for.
Well, the journey is that up until 7 years ago, as a sister midwife, working with in childbirth with mothers and babies, we had the right, and it was put into the 1967 British Abortion Act, which decriminalised abortion. Didn't make it a right, but it decriminalised it. But they purposely put in an amendment to say that anybody who had a conscientious objection did not have to participate in any way in the treatment of abortion. So this was exercised for all the years I worked as a midwife, both as a staff midwife and also as a sister midwife. However, over the years, the number of senior managers on the labour ward declined. They cut back on that for financial reasons. And it meant that the number of staff who otherwise would take part and supervise this event, the numbers were reducing. But the question about our rights was never at odds or in dispute. However, I purposely started bringing this to the management's attention because the incidents started to increase. The number of terminations coming to the labour suite started to increase, and more staff were saying, I've come into midwifery to bring life into the world, not the opposite. So I tried to get management to do something about that. And basically they wouldn't want to know, they just want you to get on with the job and not to be bothered by these problems. But I wouldn't let it go. And then there was a power struggle because the birth rate's falling in Scotland, so they're amalgamating the hospitals. And they amalgamated our own hospital, the Southern General in Glasgow, with the Queen Mother's Hospital. This other hospital, the staff were all relocated to our department, but they had been doing an awful lot more terminations than we were. So it was through that that the incidence was starting to rise in our place. And I wasn't bothered about what was right, what we had the right not to participate in, until they started changing their interpretation, and then the NMC also said we had to look after them. So then I took on this journey of challenging that, and it resulted in 3 court cases. The first time we lost in Edinburgh. Lady Smith didn't support her position. There was an appeal made, and in 2013 we won that. 3 judges unanimously supported our position. And then the Health Board appealed it again. It went down to London, because although we're in Scotland, we're still under Supreme Court rulings ultimately. So 5 judges in London said, well, it was Lady Hale that wrote up the judgment, and she restricted our rights completely, and to the point where actually it's meaningless for us who are managers of the Labour ward, because in effect they're saying that although we are supposed to send in staff midwives to look after and take care, and we have to make sure that this abortion gets done, that's not participating. So I don't know how you can think that out. So
and you're gracing this land with your presence. Doing?
Just giving talks or speaking to people who are interested in our case, because I believe there are some serious changes to the law here in the Victoria and just now as well. And it's a very worrying situation, because internationally there is this great attempt to to wipe out conscience, because the matter is conscience. It's about abortion, but it's actually conscience. And we have people who don't actually agree with our views on abortion, but they absolutely believe in our rights to exercise conscience. And this is a worrying development, I think, and people need to really, really take on board what's going on here, because we've had atheists and socialist people are very, very strong in their own areas, but they're quite appalled at how this is actually being manoeuvred.
So if we're a person who maintains that me and myself have rights, if by legislation any of those rights are taken away from me, the person who is all about me and myself, we would kick up a storm, would we not?
Absolutely.
Okay, well then we're saying your conscience is being played with.
Well, there's no question about it.
We'll let things rest on that and see how the conscience works from this moment on. You've been watching Support Life, and that's all for our program today. Join us again next week. Goodbye.